Welcome to Therapist Uncensored, a podcast where therapists freely speak their minds about real-life matters.
Hey, today's episode, we are bringing you a powerhouse, a rock star. Her name is Pat Ogden, and she is the director of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. She founded it. She also is the co-founder of Hakomi with Ron Kurtz. Now, what is Hakomi, that crazy word, and what is sensorimotor therapy? Why make it complicated, right? Basically, she is the person who put together, very originally, more depth psychology with the body and with somatic awareness, mindfulness, attachment, neuroscience. It's really great in working with trauma survivors, including prisoners, people disenfranchised and marginalized groups. She has a particular interest in multicultural issues. So you'll hear that. That's fantastic. We're super excited about that. So that's the backstory. One quick caveat is that the sound is not quite up to, well, it's not up to our normal standards. It's a backup file. This is the real story. It's a backup file, but the content was so good we wanted to publish it. And for many of you, once you start listening to it and get acclimated, you won't even notice. But for some of you, I know that are more sensitive to some of the way the recording itself actually takes place. Audio files, people that can just hear that and is distracted by that. I just wanted to give you a heads up that it is not our best sound, despite all of our efforts to try to clean it up. So without further ado, Sue Marriott, that's little old me, will be interviewing Pat Ogden. And it'll pick up right with Dr. Ogden speaking about her background. Let's do it.
Even as a child, I started studying dance when I was about 7, and I was very athletic, very much an outdoors person. So for myself, I think my own body has always been a resource for me. I still spend a lot of time in nature, hiking, and I do yoga every day. And when it really started to become applied to psychotherapy was in the early 70s when I was working in a psychiatric hospital. And I was teaching yoga and dance, both. And I noticed that the patients who did both those classes seemed to get better. And now I understand that much more clearly through Steve Porges' polyvagal theory. But then I understood it as just there must be something about the body. When people use their bodies in different ways, it can have an effect on their psychology and their mental health. So now I think of it in terms of the dance classes were very fast-paced. Back in the 70s, everybody was doing line dances, very simple steps to follow. So I'd have a whole room of people with various diagnoses following these dances, and there was high energy, and we can think of it now as it was a way of stimulating the sympathetic nervous system without fear, whereas in trauma, the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated with fear, with the fight or flight or cry for help responses. And then the yoga class, on the other hand, it was very slow-paced, very relaxing. It was almost a yin yoga practice, although I didn't understand yin yoga at that time. So through the lens of the polyvagal theory, that class was stimulating the dorsal vagal system without fear. It's interesting to look back on that and see the perhaps scientific underpinnings of why those patients seem to get better. So that was my first real application of work with the body to mental health.
That's really great. And it makes me think that, by starting already inside your own body, that just almost intuitively you were able to, without the cognitive understanding of it, but just intuitively you came to that, not even quite knowing, the specifics of how that was working.
Right. No, I was really just following my own interests. And my own body's always been my laboratory. I'm always trying things out of my own body, new ways of moving, very curious about sensations and so forth.
Yeah. And, the other thing I think about the dance classes is, in addition to that stimulation without fright, like the other thing that's happening is everyone's syncing up.
True, too. And both classes, in the yoga and the dance classes, everybody's doing the same thing at the same time. That's true.
Right. So that there's this...
That's interesting,
rhythm that is, attunement, basically.
Well, with the dance classes, definitely. Yeah, there was rhythm. Yeah, and there's the community focus, which we now know that relationship is one of the primary mediators of post-traumatic stress, if not the primary. Not motivator, mitigator. It can prevent post-traumatic stress. Attachment and relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Ari Shalev, he's a physician who runs a emergency hospital center in it's either Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And he says the first thing he does when he gets traumatized patients is get their attachment figures in there, get their family. The first thing he says, he has that connection going from the get-go because that is the best way to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder.
And so then the work, can you walk us through a little bit about then what that looks like for, in session or when you're working with people individually?
The primary interest is how the body reflects and sustains the presenting problem, whatever the client comes in with, whether they're coming in with anxiety, nightmares, relational problems, inability to control their rage, panic attacks, whatever it is. From the very first, I'm looking at implicit processes that have to do with the presenting problem because the body will always participate. The way someone uses their voices, the way they breathe, the way they walk, the way they make eye contact or don't, the way they hold their bodies, their stance and their posture, all that is related to whatever they're talking about. And so once you start seeing that with the client, you start to see that the body also holds a way through to healing. So at the beginning of a session, we have to, just like any psychotherapy, we want to build rapport, build safety, because without safety and relational connection, I think it was somebody said, Les Greenberg, I think, said that therapy can't really begin. And I feel that that's true. So we're tracking, we're making contact, both verbally and non-verbally. We're using our own bodies in a way that's uniquely relevant to that client. And so we're kind of getting the lay of the land and building relationships. And then our work is mindfulness-based with the philosophy or the belief that change happens through helping clients become aware of how they're organized inside, meaning their habitual stance, their habitual emotions, their thoughts, not the specific thoughts, but the way that they think, how they organize inside, rather than just conversation. So that's where mindfulness comes in. So we'll find a frame, what we call a frame, that sort of sets the intention for the session of what we're going to focus on. Like I might say to a client at some point, okay, so you'd really like to find out why you don't have the support you want in your life, or you're really interested in helping this panic go away. If they agree on that frame, then we go to mindfulness. Like, okay, I might ask a question like, what do you notice right now when you think of not getting support? And then because their body's going to react, maybe they'll collapse or maybe they'll mobilize. Emotions are going to come up, thoughts are going to come up. So, and that's mindfulness. Mindfulness is simply being aware of what's happening in the present moment in your body, in your emotions, and in your thoughts. And so we'll use particular stimuli like the thought of or considering not having support is going to affect the organizational experience. So it's very mindfulness-based. So we're discovering the components at the meta level of the issue rather than just talking about the content. And so then it depends. It depends on the client's goals. It depends on their regulatory capacity, whether they have a wide or narrow window of tolerance, whether it's primarily attachment-focused or primarily trauma-focused, although attachment and relationship are always in there. So that's how a session begins. And then from there, childhood memories might come up, dysregulation might come up, depending on what emerges then. certain techniques are used, certain approaches.
Right.
So if a client becomes dysregulated, either too hypo-aroused or hyper-aroused, we will use somatic interventions to help the arousal come back into the window of tolerance. But if a childhood memory comes up of attachment rupture and they have a wide enough window of tolerance, we might go right into the emotional pain of that. So we might even exaggerate the body stance. For example, one man that I worked with recently was depressed, and of course he wanted to get through that depression, but he had a wide window of tolerance, and he had the typical downward turn of his spine and his head that goes with depression. Even in animals that are depressed, they have that shortened rectus abdominis muscle that goes from the pubic bones up, that when it's shortened, it will pull your body over. And so instead of resourcing that posture, which I would have done if he was out of his window of tolerance, we would have maybe found some alignment, helped him with his breath or something. I asked him if he could exaggerate it, because that took him right into the pain and the early formative memories that had to do with that depression. So it's exaggerated it. He remembered feeling just defeated and not okay in himself as a child. And strong emotions came up. And so the path is different for every client, is what I'm trying to say. But we're wanting to, in each session, we want to end with something transformative, no matter how small. People often think a transformation has to be some big change, but it doesn't. It can just be a very small shift that the client can then take that kernel of change and work with it in the week between sessions. So for this client, his body naturally found a more aligned stance through going into the pain of that. So his posture shifted along with his depression, lifted a little bit. So then during the week, he could take that and practice that and work with it himself. And then we go on.
So a couple of things I'm hearing in that is, again, the body as resource, and you're not explaining to him how to do it. You just are leading him into his own process, and then he naturally finds both the exaggeration and where that leads, but then also the resourcing that can come by playing with that.
Well, I think you're tapping into one of our principles that is foundational to this work, and that's the idea that the client's answers to whatever's troubling them are inside themselves. They're not inside me, they're inside the client. Gregory Bateson called it organicity, which means that every living system has its own inner intelligence. And in the 70s, when I met Ron Kurtz, he was really interested in Buddhism, and we talked a lot about principles like the scientific and Buddhist principles that we take as critical to our work, because all of us have a philosophical or spiritual guidelines, whether they're conscious or not. Some therapists go into therapy thinking they have the answers for the client. For example, they've got all the education, they can help. It's not my attitude. I go into a session with the sense that they have their own answers. So then my job becomes one of helping them turn inside themselves deeply enough to find those answers. And that's where the body comes in. The body is not something to be fixed or changed. It holds so much intelligence and wisdom. So that's really another principle, if you will, that the body it's not a mechanistic thing that we can just, fix. It's just rich with knowledge and information that can help us in our evolution and our own healing.
I love that. It's so appealing, because it's definitely not the message that is typically, just that statement you said, the body is not something to be fixed or changed, that it's just peace. It provides peace, just that statement does, right?
Right, yeah. I think that's why these philosophical principles are so critical, because clients feel that the moment they walk into your office, they implicitly sense where you're coming from. And if you really believe in organicity and mind, body, spirit, holism, and the wisdom of the body, that's going to be conveyed implicitly to the client, and that already is resourcing, as opposed to going in thinking, oh, there's something really wrong with this client, I have to fix them, maybe we'll find medication for them, although at times medication is very, very useful. But we're just coming from a different orientation to therapy than at least the way I learned psychotherapy in the 70s and 80s and 60s, all those years. The therapist was responsible for the answer.
Right, and, to their patients, to have that more of the hierarchical language, and then also through interpretation, it's through more cognitive, whereas this is really honoring the body, and I love sort of the notion of that there's wisdom that, you're tapping into. Is there anybody that you wouldn't lead into their body is that kind of what you were referring to when you were saying that some you would resource and some you wouldn't?
Both of those I would lead into the body. Like with the client who's depressed, we used his body by exaggerating his stance to go more deeply into the depression, into the roots of that. So I asked him to literally become more slumped over, more exaggerated, as a little experiment, and to find out what happens. There's no patient that I would not use the body with. However, you do need to be very resonant with how you use the body with each client. Like some highly dissociative clients are terrified of their bodies. Their bodies have been the battleground for all the trauma they've experienced, and there's no way they want to go into their bodies because when they do, they get more dysregulated. Yeah, you have to find different ways to build confidence and to build resources. Sometimes I've asked, is there any place inside that feels good? Sometimes you don't even use the word body, or at least not at the beginning. Or sometimes I remember with one client, when she would sit down, she would really get frozen and sometimes mute, and she would not be able to even share what was going on with her because she would get so frozen. So I used to meet her at the door and say, you know what, let's start by walking. Let's just walk around the block and talk a little bit. But we didn't talk about the body, but that was resourcing. Movement is resourcing. And if she could talk a little bit about her trauma while moving, that alone was healing, because her default defense was to freeze whenever the trauma came up. So there are ways of working with different clients with the body that's appropriate for them. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all.
No, but I love what you're saying, though. Is you still use the body. You just access it in different ways. So
that's right.
Yeah, you kind of sneak up on it.
In some ways you do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like by the walking, that
right.
Even the dancing, even that original, the dancing and the yoga is, the kind of conscious on the part of the patient. The client to know that that's what's happening, but it doesn't matter because it works anyway. Yeah,
exactly. I think that's really true. It doesn't all have to be made conscious, because when the body, when those procedural tendencies start to shift, healing will happen. It's much more the experience that is important than the narrative and the cognitive understanding. Clients have a new experience that opens the door for a new way of being.
I really love that, because also sometimes when we engage more cognitively, we're likely to hit a defense or, to arouse the fear that is exactly right.
Right, and when it might not be integrated on all levels. It might arouse the fear, or it might just be ideas without really integrating.
You mentioned the principles, and I think that you said two of them, that the answers are inside the self and holds it there, and our job is just to help them access themselves. And then the body is not something to be fixed or changed. Were there other principles that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, they kind of flow into each other. Like if you really believe that the client has the answers that they need, that they have that intelligence inside, there's no need to really push. what the therapist then needs to do is to find that kernel that is already moving towards healing and towards health, and then help that expand and grow. So it's not a provocative or pushy kind of therapy, the principle that we would call nonviolence then. There's no need to be paradoxical or to be forceful if you believe in organicity. So it naturally, and within that, there's the idea that there's a unity there with you and your client, that you're not really separate. It's that non-hierarchical approach that I think you referred to. You're really connected, that there's a sameness, there's not a separation. So that then, all these principles really influence what your interventions are. So if you trust in that and sense that unity principle, you're going to be open yourself with your client. You're not going to try to trick them, really. You're going to be thinking out loud, sharing with them your thoughts. Not all your thoughts, but...
Well, there's a transparency that you're mentalizing out loud on purpose.
Yeah, you are. You are mentalizing out loud, and you're working in sync. So I'm likely to say, I wonder if we should follow this track, or should we go this other way? Like, what do you think? And we'll collaborate a lot together. Now, some people confuse unity to just mean sameness, but it doesn't. Like if you're in that principle, you're also aware of differences. Like Shelley Harrell always says, we're completely alike in some ways. We're not alike at all. We're very unique. And some of us are more alike than others. So we each have our cultural context, our social location, where we come from. We belong to different groups. Like, I'm not a person of color, so I don't belong to that group. But in the principle of unity, and I want to work within that multicultural perspective of honoring those differences as well as our similarities.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. What comes to my mind is the notion of harmonizing, where that each person has their own distinct voice, but then there's this connection across, that if we get it right, that we amplify, one another. We're not competing, we're collaborating.
Right.
Without giving up our differentiation.
Well, I think that's true on an individual basis, and I also think that's true on a cultural basis. And that's important in terms of the body, too, because the body as a resource is different depending on the cultural context. So that's a way that these principles fit together. Like we really do honor the wisdom of the body. That's another principle, and we honor that wisdom may look very different for one person than another. Different postures are more as a resource in other cultures. If you're in a marginalized culture, for example, a collapsed posture might be a resource for you in a specific context. I was talking with an Asian woman recently who was saying just that. Her collapsed posture was a resource for her because she was Asian and she's experienced so much discrimination and so much bullying and et cetera. So that's a different kind of resource for her than someone who grew up in an abusive family, who kept so small to not be seen in that family. Those are really important considerations with the body.
I love it.
Multicultural perspective.
That's right, and you're looking for the wisdom, right, versus pathologizing something.
Absolutely, that's a general principle, and the wisdom of not only the individual but the social location of that person. Yeah,
that's right. And without that context and without that history, it's hard to see the whole person. But when you change the frame to the historical aspects of the culture and the community, then you're able to see them more as a whole being.
That's right. And I think that many methods, including sensorimotor psychotherapy, come from a more Eurocentric perspective. And we need to, all of us, sensorimotor psychotherapy, many methodologies need to take a look at that, because that's not inclusive. That's only coming from a white dominance perspective, quite frankly. And so we're looking at that in our school and taking steps to change that in our teaching and future.
And it sounds like taking steps to learn, because it might not be in our own body of experience, but it's like going out and learning. The attachment research in general is, even though it has been done internationally, it can't be an accident that, that if you're married and you own a home and you have a good job that has possibility for advancement, that there's a few of these factors that then you're like 98% chance that you are secure on the AI.
Right, yeah. That's right.
So
that's exactly right.
It's embedded in that versus...
That's right there is a certain model that doesn't speak cross-culturally.
Right. The health of being vigilant and, what we might call preoccupied, but of looking out for danger. If you're in a community where the danger is real, and it also makes me think when you're talking about the body, that there was a study that African American children that have very positive relationships with their mothers compared to Anglo American children who also have positive relationships with their mothers, their waking cortisol level of the African American children are higher just upon wakening, unrelated to relationship with parents. So that would translate exactly, and there's not a good explanation for that other than this very deeply ingrained historical, the genetic level, like in the Holocaust when it actually changed your genes of a whole culture.
Oh, like with gene expression?
Yes, with gene expression. With the strain that the community has been under for so many years, that
exactly,
down. Yeah.
Right. And I think that we need to be aware of that in terms of the body, too. Like in that environment, postures that reflect different kinds of trauma-based defenses are adaptive and have nothing to do with the family context, nothing to do with attachment, and have everything to do with the danger that many marginalized peoples find themselves in on a daily basis. So a collapsed posture or a mobilized posture can be very adaptive in those contexts. And we can't automatically assume that it has to do with attachment relationships.
I think that's, are you familiar with Patricia Critenden's work?
Not a lot, no. I know you sent me something on that this morning, I think, but I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Well, one of the reasons that I love it is that she was also a student of Mary Ainsworth, but she definitely had a more wider cultural lens and was very interested in just the body's response to danger and things like that. But I was wondering, do you know other folks besides, it sounds like your school, that are pursuing this multicultural, really trying to, being interested in this and incorporating this into our work? What I'm thinking is that if our listeners may be very interested in pursuing updating, and is there someone that you know and respect that?
There are just tons of people who are working in a multicultural perspective. Shelley Harrell she's at Pepperdine. She and I are collaborating together, writing a paper right now, hopefully to turn into a book on racism and trauma and how to address both from a white dominance perspective and from a marginalized communities perspective. Christine Caldwell and her colleagues just put out a book called Oppression in the Body. That's an edited volume of different authors who have been discriminated against for different reasons, like for being overweight, for being trans, for being Latino. So that's a very interesting book. I wrote a blurb for that. I thought that was a courageous endeavor.
Now, also, do you mind if we take half a step back? Because I want to catch people up if they're less familiar with your work. One of the things, it's just now part of my lexicon, this window of tolerance, but some people might not quite understand what that means, and I think it's a really good encapsulation of many of these ideas. This is your reference, right?
Yeah, well, here's the history behind that. I think it was in the early 90s, I was thinking so much about my traumatized clients and how they couldn't regulate arousal. And I grew up in a musical family. My mother actually taught me to play the piano before I went to school. So by the time I was 7, I was playing sonatas. But I'm not an accomplished pianist at all. But the language of music was really, I was taught that language and taught to read music before I learned to read. So music is very much a part of my life. And I was thinking about how we modulate arousal through music, like through how loud or how soft, how fast, how slow we play, whether we're playing in a minor key or a major key, that we can really manipulate people's emotions and arousal through music. And I was thinking of modulation, like how we modulate from one key to another. So I made this graph, and I call it the modulation model, that is the same graph that we now call the window of tolerance, with hyperarousal at the very high end, over, like if you think of two parallel lines a distance apart, that's the window of tolerance, or your optimal arousal zone, within which you can process whatever's coming up from the inside and whatever stimuli are occurring from the outside. You can process that. You can integrate it. If you get too aroused into hyperarousal over the top line of the window of tolerance, your integrative capacity is compromised, as Pierre Genet said back in the 1800s. And if you get too low in the hypoaroused or dorsal vagal zone, below the bottom line, your integrative capacity is also compromised. So this was the modulation model for years, like a decade. And we taught it in our classes, and we taught students to recognize the signs of when arousal was approaching the upper end, because you want to catch arousal before it goes into that zone where clients can no longer integrate. So that's where resources come in at the extremes of either end. And then in 1999, Dan Siegel's book, The Developing Mind, came out. And in that book, he referenced the same phenomena and called it the window of tolerance. So we adapted his term because it was more catchy and more accessible. Dan made up the term. I made up the graph and the
idea.
So, we use it with his blessing. But it's so valuable for especially therapists to conceptualize their client's regulatory capacity, because every client has a different window of tolerance. Like the client that I talked about earlier who was depressed, he actually had a wide window of tolerance, which is why we could do a physical movement that would take him into more dysregulation, strong emotions. He was sobbing. Whereas a traumatized client, anyone who had a narrow window of tolerance, you wouldn't want to do that with, because they would shoot up into the hyperarousal zone. They wouldn't be able to integrate. Yeah, and I learned that actually in a very painful way in the 70s, because I was asked to be a consultant therapist for the University of Colorado's mental health center, and they referred to me these young women, these college students who weren't able to experience any sexual pleasure. And nobody understood trauma back in the 70s. You're probably not old enough to remember, but Charles Bigley's book hadn't come out. Judy Herman's book hadn't come out. Nobody was reading Pierre Genet. He was lost at that time to our field. So I didn't understand trauma either, and I was helping these young women go into strong emotions related to their childhood memories, and they were getting worse. They were getting more dysregulated, more dissociative, and I didn't understand why. But I understand it now. It's because they had narrow windows of tolerance. They had all been sexually abused as children, and they didn't have the regulatory capacity to integrate the strong emotions that I was helping them re-experience in therapy. So I had to really change my tactic I remember saying to my colleague, I'm not going to worry about the emotions. I'm just going to keep them in their bodies and try to keep them in relationship with me. And lo and behold, they started getting better. So that was my introduction to how attachment-related emotional interventions or approaches can fall short in working with our traumatized clients who don't have the integrative capacity to address attachment-related needs,
Mm-hmm. Yes, but even helping them, co-regulating them into the window of tolerance, and helping them keep their thinking but staying connected to you and keep their
right.
I see that still as highly attachment related work, and
it is.
Yeah,
it is, but not when I guess I wasn't clear. When I mean attachment, I mean resolving those emotional wounds that go with when your father is sexually abusing you.
Right.
That's where I was going. I was helping them experience the deep betrayal and pain of that, and they weren't ready for that yet. But you're right, exactly. The co-regulation of using the relationship and using somatic resources to help widen their window of tolerance, that's definitely attachment focused as well. Our work is very attachment focused. I come from an attachment background. I mean, relationship has always been my front and center.
Right, so it's not technique oriented where you're applying a technique to a person. It's very individualized. It's very relationally based.
Yes, that's right. I think one of the compliments I treasure is Philip Bromberg. When he saw my work, he said, "You are not a handmaiden to your technique." And I took that as a big compliment, because if you're a
wow, that is that's a wonderful compliment.
Yeah, you're not. We're never trying to make our clients fit our method, which can be a danger when you have a methodology that you make your client fit your method, rather than make your method fit your client. We're using the body, yes, but it's never in a generic way. It's always very individual.
Oh, I think that is so vital. It is so easy, especially therapists can gather around a technique and begin to learn it and feel emboldened, and then end up unintentionally, it becomes again like top down instead of this organic, in the moment dance.
You're looking for your client to adapt to that technique. Which is why I don't like formulas. I think we are way too complex for formulaic work. I mean, I understand that brand new therapists might need some sort of roadmap, but formulaic methodology doesn't honor the complexity of each person that comes into our practice, in my mind. And it's not fun. Who wants to do a formula? It's much more creative to, follow and work with that unique situation.
Well, I think it's a really important subject, actually, because I think I experience sometimes exactly that. And then what happens when we get really, that once you learn something and you turn around and you teach it, then you really actually believe it's better than other things. And so it sets people up, if the client isn't participating in the formula, to unintentionally pathologize them.
Well, right. Yes, I think that's true. It makes them feel inadequate, or like they're not doing it right. That's right.
So whatever the technique is, even for example, I think everything is subject to that, which is I love Phil Bromberg. I mean, believe me, I would love to bring Phil Bromberg. He's not a traveler, but when you said his name, my heart just opened up. I was like, oh.
Well, he's, I think, the most poetic writer in our field. His books are pure joy. Highly recommend him. He's on our advisory board and has helped me understand relational psychoanalysis in ways that I surely didn't understand before.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, what author could we say where I flutter, right? Or it's the effect of his prose and his work. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's beautiful. So then, what about? You've talked some about some of the adjustments that you've made. Is there anything going forward that you're beginning to look towards, or any other adjustments that you've learned and shifted your thinking, so we finish this arc?
Well, we're really working right now as an institute and a trainer body, administrative and trainer body, in looking at the Eurocentricity of sensorimotor psychotherapy, because it does come from a white Eurocentric model. And we're looking at how, like you said, we can pathologize clients. For example, if we're not honoring social location, like that we've already talked about, so with the body. So we're looking at our own implicit bias very deeply, We meet every other week on this, doing an in-service with all our trainers, with professionals on implicit bias, because I think as predominantly white organization, not entirely, but predominantly, we have to be very willing to look at white dominance and the privilege that comes with that, and how we can't help but be steeped in that growing up in this culture. Because, I mean, for me, growing up in the 50s and 60s, I mean, I remember I think I was about 4, seeing the separate fear for African-American children and asking my mother what was going on, you know. So we're steeped in that. Even though I marched in civil rights movement, et cetera, I am steeped in a culture that has a ton of implicit bias that's not recognized, and that can come through in our teaching and the way we use the body. So we're really looking at that deeply in the Institute, and that's very exciting and very personal, because I have nieces and nephews who are Black, and they're very excited about this as well.
Well, I bet.
That's a big movement forward in the whole organization.
Because it does get tricky, because many of the people probably that you're training and many of us in the field consider ourselves liberal and, you know, on the right side of justice and all of these things. But
there's no way we can protect ourselves from implicit bias. No matter how liberal we are, it's still there. And the worst mistake we can make is saying that we're not racist, because we are. This is a racist culture, and we're just steeped in it from the time we're little children. So we have to look at that awareness before we can. And we have to gather knowledge. Something I learned from Shelley Harrell as well. She talked about this at one of the consultations our school did with her, that without that awareness, any skill we apply will fall flat. It won't go deep, and we're not that kind of organization. So we really need to look at that on a very personal level and then acquire the knowledge and the skill to apply it in our work. So, yeah, I'm excited about that. I'm horrified, as are many of our trainers, at how ignorant we've been. Like my mission was to bring the body into the mainstream, and I think that mission, I think I've accomplished, not single-handedly, but I've been a part of that mission that fulfilled. But it hasn't been my mission, but it's becoming my mission. So that's exciting. And, you know, then on other levels we're looking at, and I'm interested in couples work and children and family, and I'm also very interested in these principles, these philosophical, spiritual principles that really create the context for therapy, because I think most therapists aren't aware that they have principles, that they have beliefs that they're coming from. And in sensorimotor therapy, we do have a certain orientation based on Ron Kurtz's work and adding to that.
And do you have those principles? Is there something like a PDF or anything like that we could share with our listeners? Or
no, but I'm writing about it right now.
Okay.
Bonnie Goldstein and I did a conference, the Interpersonal Neurobiology conference that we do every year for, I've been a part of that conference, I think, for 16 years now, with Dan Siegel. And
the one in L.A.
Yeah, the one in L.A. And a few years ago we did one with that was focused on consciousness with Dan and Deepak Chopra and others. And we're writing a chapter on that where we talked about these principles. Bonnie Goldstein, one of our trainers. So that book will be coming out probably this year, and I don't even know the name of it. But Dan Siegel and Marion Solomon are the editors, and it's through Norton. We're completing that chapter. I mean, I've written quite a bit on manuals. Ron Kurtz's book, The Hakomi Method, 1992, gives brief reference to them, I think. But we've also added to them, like, one of my appreciations of Philip Bromberg is his work on therapeutic enactments. And I'm not quite sure what we can call it as a principle, but there's something, that concept fits into our overall orientation as therapists, that we don't treat therapeutic enactments as something, as a mistake, as something wrong. There's something very right about enactments that speaks to the humanness of a therapist and client coming together and the evolutionary thrust of both parties towards a higher organization. So these enactments are a part of that. When there's a therapeutic enactment where the histories of each come together into an impasse or a stalemate, where you feel like therapy is just not going anywhere and you start to lose your confidence as a therapist, there's intelligence in that. Like there's a big opportunity there. That's not an error. It's not a mistake. It's an opportunity. Like somebody was doing a workshop on the mistakes of therapy, of therapists. But Philip really taught me not to call it a mistake because it isn't. Most therapists look at it as a mistake. So that fits with our philosophical orientation. But I don't know what to call it. All the like organicity, unity, nonviolence, body, spirit, holism, presence, mindfulness, and they all have a kind of a poetic resonance.
And spiritual, yes. But no, I know exactly what you mean, because if you're applying all these other principles and there's no way, and the body, we're following the body, and then the body ends up in a situation like this, then it's the symptom is the solution. There's wisdom in it and something to be learned by it versus pathologizing either the patient or the therapist.
Or their interaction.
As long as there's like this third looking down, working,
right.
Trying to make it more explicit and decode it. But decoding it together. Yeah, that's right. And I think that takes a lot of humility on the part of the therapist to be willing to look at yourself and realize, as Philip said, it's not just a story about the client. It's a story about the two of you. Yes. And you can't escape your history. And I guess where it would become pathological would be if there was there was a non-collaboration or just a refusal to look at it from this third eye. If it just stays in an enactment and never gets
negotiated relationally. Right. Yeah. And I think the tendency, therapists can either blame themselves and or blame their client. And once that comes in, you've lost the chance to see it as a salubrious opportunity that's part of that evolutionary progression,
Yes.
I mean, it's no accident that certain therapists and certain clients come together, and I think searching for the intelligence in that means you do honor the enactments that come forward.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's beautiful. I really like how you said that. Now, for just as we wrap up, is there anything, so for folks that are not therapists, is there any message you would like to deliver to them specifically about, a piece of advice or a suggestion related to this based on what you know?
Well, I would say in terms of the body, to start to get curious about the body, like get curious about your posture, not judgmental about it. To start to inquire into the wisdom of your own body rather than wishing it would change. Like if you have panic attacks, or if your shoulders are hunched up, or if you have a collapsed spine, or if you don't like the way your body moves, or you notice a certain characteristic of it, start to become curious about that and see what it can teach you. Like become aware of it and mindful of it. I mean, I think that's how I use my own body as a laboratory. Like I really notice when my body, when I get tight, or when my breath gets short, or when I start to puff out my chest a little, like take on an attitude of power or something, or an attitude or a slumped posture. All those tell me a lot about myself. And when I can get curious about that in the moment and keep that sense of mindfulness of my own body in the moment and shift my response, my physical response, then it also can really help the struggles I have in my life, like relationally or whatever, performance-wise. And like I know, for example, when I'm teaching, I used to have such awful stage fright that I thought I'm going to have to give up teaching. I just can't do it. And then I realized, well, if I just keep my body moving, like keep my spine fluid, I noticed that I could get very stiff. And if I just keep my body moving, I'm fine. That became a huge resource for me. So that's that's above and beyond psychotherapy. We can all use our bodies in that way. Because we can become curious about our physicality, and that's a lifelong. Your body's a lifelong laboratory of learning. So,
and that's a huge one, because if even that's all that happens for our listeners right now, that can really, because the other thing it does is it embodies the notion of attunement. And because as you're aware of a stiffness and then maybe a micro adjustment to try something on, what's also happening relationally is we're really attuning to ourselves, and then it will be much more natural when we're able to do that for ourselves to be able to do that in a dyad across relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say, first be curious about it. That tension in my spine is a fear response. I'm pulling everything in. It's kind of, I don't want to be seen kind of response, and which goes back to my childhood, right? So get curious about it first. So it's not just trying to fix or change something in your body. The movement of my spine now isn't an overriding of that fear. It's a communication that I don't have to be there now. I would say to the listeners, don't just try to change your body. Get curious about the wisdom of it, and then the resources come naturally.
Right. No, I like that. Again, fine-tuning what I said, because it goes right back to the principles. It's not something to be fixed, and that's what I was thinking. When I was thinking of micro adjustment, I was like exploring. What about this?
Yeah.
And what about that? And what about
exactly. Yeah.
But I love that, because it's just so principle oriented of to trust it and to trust yourself, and it's also just, I can also feel, just as we are kind of finishing with this, it's very non-shaming, because it's the way you talk about it. Even if my spine is hunched or my shoulders are down, or if I'm haughty, that it's, if we think of it bottom up, that our body is expressing something or trying to tell us something, it really takes the shame out of that.
Well, right. So, that's exactly right. And to realize that your body has adapted to everything that's happened in your life. So we develop patterns that are often adaptive for our childhoods that we're still into, we superimpose the past on our presence, but that it was a creative and adaptive response. I think that's what you're saying to. Absolutely.
First of all, thank you so much. I feel like we've covered a lot of really great stuff. I know people are going to be really happy to hear from you. And if they would like to reach out to you or learn about your school, can you share the best way to do that?
Oh, sure. They can. Our school, we have a website, Sensorimotor.org, and if you Google Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, you'll find many resources and et cetera. So yeah, that's the way to find us.
Okay,
just go to the website. You can contact the school. If you want to contact me personally, just contact the school and put attention Pat Ogden, and they'll forward to me.
Okay, awesome. And then we'll also link, of course, your books, and also some of the books that we mentioned and the work that, or, the books that you mentioned here too. So, including Phil Bromberg.
Yes.
So for our listeners, thank you so much. I really, really want to challenge you and invite you to try these things on and look into more of Pat Ogden's work, because it will just take you further and further with this material. This is just an introduction. So, well, thank you so much, and I appreciate your time. And
okay, you're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening, and appreciate you hanging in there. And we are going to get back on track in our normal and hopefully getting better and better audio as we go forward. So for those of you who enjoyed it, please move on over to our Facebook page and give us a shout out, say hello, like us, join us, share us. There's a second one that's a private Facebook page that we just asked to exchange that for your email address. We send out an email like hardly ever, but we are wanting to build a online community, and there you can post and chat and visit with other neuronerds like all of us. You can share your own links and stories and ask questions and all that kind of fun community stuff, which we want to promote. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you soon.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.